Our study in the book of Genesis does continue today with a devotional titled Jacob and Esau, a not so happy family. I invite you to open your Bible with me to Genesis 27 and chapter 28. Well, when we concluded our study of Genesis 26, we found Isaac, his wife Rebekah, and his family living in Gerar, a Philistine area of Canaan that he named Beersheba. Genesis 26, 32 and 33. Now, knowing he was 60 years old when Rebekah conceived twin sons, we can assume Isaac was 100 years old in Genesis 27, for his sons were 40 years old. Furthermore, Esau, the older son, had committed bigamy by taking 2 Hittite women to be his wives in chapter 26 and verse 34. Now, those heathen wives were from a lineage of idolaters, and we've already read that they were a grief of mind or a grief of heart unto Isaac and to Rebekah, Genesis 26 and verse 35. Now that brings us to Genesis 27. And here we find in the first 5 verses, Isaac purposed to bless Esau. Now, time marches on for all, and Genesis 27 opens with a sad statement. We read in verse 1, Isaac was old, and his eyes were dim, so that he could not see. Now that is a problem that people living in the desert with the bright sunlight as well as the sand would often in their older age, would be inflicted with blindness. And that could be the reason that for Isaac's blindness here. And so nearly blind, perhaps due to cataracts from the effect of the desert sun in his hand, he had determined it was time to put his household in order and prepare for his death. Calling for his eldest son, Esau came to his father, and he said to his father, in verse 1 of 27, Behold, here am I. Now Isaac encouraged Esau to take his bow and go out to the field and take some venison. Chapter 27, verse 3. He stated his purpose was to eat and then bless Esau before he died. Now the father's blessing in ancient times carried a far more significant meaning than it does today. The blessing was more than a statement of the father's will. It encompassed the passing of the torch of leadership, involved the kindness of the Lord to his posterity, and encompassed the blessing and affecting the world for good. And so Isaac was ready to make Esau his heir of all things, both spiritually and physically. Well, we come to verse 6 through 17, and Rebekah countervailed Isaac to obtain his blessing for Jacob rather than for Esau. Now, Rebekah had overheard Isaac's instructions to Esau, and she realized her husband's plans were contrary to God's will. Rather than trust the Lord to providentially work and fulfill his promise that Jacob, the second-born son, was his chosen heir, Rebekah determined to deceive Isaac, her husband, that she might assure it would happen as God promised. In other words, I guess we almost could say that she decided that God needed a little bit of help. Well, she readied Jacob to masquerade as his brother Esau. Beginning in verse 18 through verse 46, we find Jacob's success. He did, by masquerading as his brother, obtain Isaac's blessing. And so Rebekah prepared a meal for Jacob to present to his father. Now, although Isaac had doubts, Jacob masqueraded as his brother and deceived his father and obtained the blessing he meant to give to Esau. Well, upon Esau's return from the hunt, he came to his father and he learned that Jacob had stolen his blessing. Isaac physically trembled, knowing that the Lord had intervened to fulfill his prophetic plan for his sons, and that was that Esau would serve his brother Jacob. When Esau realized his father had been deceived, Genesis 27 and verse 33, he was, Esau, overcome with grief, and he bewailed losing his father's blessing. Now, though he pleaded to be blessed, Isaac confessed he could not, for Jacob had, and I quote, verse 34 and 35, with subtlety, or that is by fraud, taken away his, Esau's, blessing. Now, the consequences of Jacob's scheming infuriated Esau. His brother had taken his birthright and now his inheritance. Rather than blessing, Isaac confirmed to Esau that which the Lord had foretold. Verse 40, thou shalt serve thy brother. Well, we read in verse 41 that Esau hated Jacob and vowed to kill Jacob after his father's death. Now, when Rebekah heard the threats of her eldest son, she appealed to Isaac, and she requested Jacob be sent to her family in Haran for his safety and to find a wife among her people. That brings us to Genesis 28. And so here we have where Isaac sent Jacob away to his mother's kindred. Genesis 28 and verses 1 through 9. And so knowing the blessing he had bestowed upon Jacob was irrevocable, Isaac confirmed God's covenant blessing on his youngest son, and then he commanded Jacob, arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel thy mother's father, and take thee a wife from thence of the daughters of Laban thy mother's brother. Now he repeated, that is Isaac, repeated the blessing and confirmed God's covenant rested upon Jacob, verses 3 and 4. Well, Esau, seeing Isaac repeat his blessing upon his younger brother and commanded him to not take a wife of the daughters of Canaan, well, he in turn then sought a wife from Abraham's lineage and took a daughter of Ishmael to be his wife. And sadly, the desire to do the right thing was too late for Esau. Then if you'll notice verses 10 through 15, the Lord met and spoke to Jacob. Now Jacob's flight took him from Beersheba to a place called Bethel, meaning the house of God, and there he stopped for rest. Now it was some 40 miles that he had traveled. Physically and emotionally exhausted, we read that Jacob slept. And the Lord came to him in a vision of a ladder that reached from heaven to earth. And in his dream, Jacob beheld, verses 11 and 12, he beheld the angels of God ascending and descending on the ladder. And there the Lord confirmed to Jacob that he, Jacob, was chosen, and the promises of the Abrahamic covenant would pass through him to his heirs and not through Esau. The Lord then promised, and I quote, I am with thee, and will keep thee in all places whither thou goest, and will bring thee again into this land. For I will not leave thee until I have done that which I have spoken to thee of. Verse 15. Jacob then believed and dedicated himself to the Lord. Verse 16 through verse 22. Now Jacob awoke and understood that as the Lord had been with Abraham and his father Isaac, he would be with him. Verse 16. Now fearing the Lord and revering the place he had appeared to him, Jacob dedicated and called the place Bethel, meaning the house of God. Verse 17 through 19. Now Jacob then devoted himself to the Lord and promised, I will surely give the tenth unto thee. The tenth, understand, being a tithe. Genesis 28 and verse 22. Well, closing thoughts. The next chapters in our study of Genesis will follow God's sovereign work of grace in Jacob's life. You and I will see the Lord providentially transform Jacob, the deceiver, into Israel, and one who has power with God. Well, I invite you to continue with us in our study as we work our way through the Bible. If you'll be faithful in following these video devotionals, but particularly if you would subscribe to heartofashepherd.com, you will have a universal or a global understanding of the sovereignty and the providence of God, not only through Israel, but ultimately through Jesus Christ. I hope that you will continue with us in our study. God bless, and bye-bye.